How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the channel. In today's episode, I wanted to find out if it's okay to mix salt and yeast directly. So let's go to the kitchen and do some experiments. You wouldn't believe how many times people have commented under my videos telling me that it's wrong to mix the salt and yeast together. But if you're a subscriber, you would know that I do this in every single recipe. It has never failed me. So why is it that so many people think that it's a bad thing? What exactly happens when you mix salt and yeast? Does it even affect fermentation in the slightest? Today we're going to settle this once and for all with a few side-by-side comparisons. I'm going to make 3 doughs. They will all contain the exact same amount of flour, water, yeast and salt. The temperature of the equipment and all the ingredients is exactly the same. The temperature of the final dough will also be exactly the same. The only difference between the 3 will be in the way that I mix them. The one on the left will be made in my usual style. I'll add the salt and yeast to the water. I'll mix it to fully dissolve the salt and the yeast before adding the flour. The one in the middle will be made by dissolving the yeast, then adding the flour and sprinkling the salt on top of the flour and then mixing to a dough. So the salt and yeast will not be in direct contact. Lastly, the one on the right will be made by mixing the yeast with the water, fully dissolving it, then adding the flour, mixing this to a dough. And only once it's fully mixed, I will add the salt and incorporate it into the dough. So technically, the one on the right should be even less affected by the salt. Kneading a dough for this kind of experiment would add another variable, which might make things too unpredictable. So I decided to make a 90% hydration dough, which will require no kneading. By just mixing it, I thought it would keep things more equal between the 3. And since the main argument of the people who think that it's wrong to mix salt and yeast is that it's going to hinder fermentation, this will be a suitable test for it. But don't get me wrong, salt does slow down fermentation, that's just how it is. It draws the moisture to the cell walls of yeast, dehydrating it. That process is called osmosis, and people know this. And I guess that's why they think that mixing salt and yeast would cause this extreme osmosis, which would kill the yeast cells and slow down fermentation, or even stop it completely. And I showed this effect in my salt video, in which I explained the exact effects of salt in fermentation. In that video, I made a 10% salt dough, and it didn't rise at all. Maybe it would have risen if I left it for even longer, but that was not the point of the video. You don't make a 10% salt bread and eat it. You'd rarely go over 2.5%. And speaking of percentages, it's 2.2% salt in this recipe here, and that is 0.2% higher than my standard amount. So if this salt killing yeast theory is true, we should see some clear evidence in this experiment. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that salt will not kill yeast. We are talking about bread making here, nothing else. If salt can kill a human, it can most certainly kill a tiny microorganism. As you can see, the dough in the middle is 1/10 of a degree warmer than the other 2. That is insignificant. In practical terms, the conditions here are exactly the same for all 3 doughs. I will leave them to ferment for around 5 hours. And as you can see, the one on the left and one in the middle, they are rising pretty much at the same rate. Surprisingly, the one on the right was rising most slowly, even though that's the one where we kept the salt to the last minute. And that's by no means a fermentation issue. It is because I mixed the dough once, then I waited, added salt and mixed it again. This second mixing step for incorporating the salt developed more gluten, and that made the dough tighter. The rate of fermentation was exactly the same as the other ones, it just didn't expand as much, so it's a bit of a false alarm there. Regardless, the dough that was made by mixing the salt and yeast and fully dissolving them and then adding the flour, it was no slower than the other one. But I wasn't 100% happy with this experiment, so let's try again. This time the rules are almost exactly the same as before. The only difference will be that we will leave the salt and yeast to sit for 5 minutes in the water. I mean, you would never realistically do this. I have never been in a situation where I mixed my salt and yeast and I left them to sit before adding the flour. I normally just mix it right away, like I did in the previous experiment. So if the salt is killing the yeast, then it should definitely have some effect on it after sitting for 5 minutes together. And I think dragging out this experiment to 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, there's no point. It's not a real life situation. 5 minutes is already an unreasonably long time. But if you are bored at home one day, maybe you can do that experiment. Let us know down in the comments what you find. Okay, so this has all been mixed. Now we'll leave it to sit for 5 minutes. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about the principles of baking, do check out the Principles of Baking playlist on my channel. And don't forget about the steps of baking. Each is just as important as the next, and understanding them will instantly turn you into a better baker. And for my subscribers, I keep forgetting to tell you, I got this Flickr page. I know a lot of you want to share the pictures of your bakes with me, and that's the perfect place to do it, because you won't only be sharing your bakes with me, but with other bakers from this channel. It's a nice little community there. Also, if you are interested in the equipment that I'm using and recommending, do check out my Amazon shops, link below the video. Okay, enough of that, let's get back to the dough. It is still exactly the same process, and again, I have to mix the final dough twice to incorporate the salt, so we should expect it to rise more slowly than the other two, just because of that extra gluten development, and I'm not sure if there's anything I could have done about it. Anyway, the difference between number 1 and 2 should give us enough evidence. By the way, if you want the exact amounts of ingredients for this recipe, you can find them on my website, linked below. If you are curious about these jars that I'm using, they are little Nutella jars, and they come with nice plastic lids that slide on. They're the most perfect jars to use for a sourdough starter. They're so easy to clean because they have a concave bottom, and they're really common here in the UK. Don't know about other countries though. Okay, so I'll just bash these down so they're the same level, and we can start our test. And once again, I left them for about 5 hours. Fingers crossed. These bread time lapses are so fun to watch, it never gets old. Be it baking or fermenting, it's just crazy to see something that you'd never see in real life. And I guess that's what makes them interesting. Even more interesting is that the dough is rising at the same rate. Even after letting the yeast and salt mingle for 5 minutes at a high concentration, it made no difference. And no, the dough didn't go crazy, I just played in reverse there. So there you have it, we have finally answered it. Does mixing yeast and salt have a negative effect on fermentation? No, it doesn't. Should you mix your salt and yeast? If that is more convenient for you, like it is for me, then yeah, absolutely. I don't like complicating things, and dissolving the salt and yeast before adding the flour just makes sense. So what do you think of these results? Do you still think it's a bad thing to mix salt and yeast together? Let me know down in the comments. To see more videos like this one, click over here. Subscribe to the channel, click right here. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.